Hello and welcome to the first episode of Season 2 of Defense Uncut. This is, of course, still the first dedicated English language Pakistani defense news and commentary podcast, where we unpack Pakistani military procurements, events, and broader strategic issues in focused detail so you can build a clearer and more accurate big picture. So it's good to be back. We've been away for about 5 months, and during that time I spent a lot of time thinking about what this next phase of Defense Uncut and Quwa more broadly should look like. The reality is that Quwa is a commercial publication, and I'm treating it seriously as one. That means every decision now has to connect back to building something sustainable and something stronger. Because if we grow properly, then we can reinvest that growth into better coverage, such as attending major trade shows, building out on-the-ground reporting, working with correspondents from around the world, speaking directly to decision makers, industry officials, and others who shape the issues we cover and you care about. And ultimately, that means a better product for you. At the same time, I never liked the idea of taking things away from people just to create a paywall. That's not how I want to grow Quwa. If we charge, it should be for something that clearly adds value, not for something you've already come to expect from us. So with that in mind, I am very happy to say that Defense Uncut is back exactly as you remember it, free and every week. But alongside that, we have also launched a new subscription tier called Quwa Plus. And really, Quwa Plus is for those of you who want to go beyond the podcast and beyond the headlines. With Quwa Plus, you get 2 South Asia focused defense news and analysis articles per week. These are the kinds of pieces that they don't just tell you about what happened, but really explain what it means, why it matters, and where it could be heading. You also get access to the full Quwa Premium archive from the past 10 years, which includes a huge body of exclusive reporting on Pakistan's defense procurement and development programs. And on top of that, we're launching a new podcast called Pulse Check, where Asim ul-Islam and myself will go deeper into the institutional, structural, and policy side of Pakistan's defense issues. That means looking less at just the platform or headline itself, and more at how the Pakistani defense establishment actually thinks, functions, and makes decisions. We're also lining up guests who've served in the armed forces, worked closely with political leadership, and understand the bureaucracy from the inside. So the idea with Pulse Check is to give you a much better feel for the system behind the stories. And then on top of that, what used to be Quwa Premium, which we've been offering for the past 7 to 8 years, is now Quwa Professional or Quwa Pro. Quwa Pro includes everything in Plus, but adds dedicated market intelligence. This is where we go deeper into procurement trends, force development, capability gaps, industrial activity, and where Pakistan's defense ecosystem may actually be heading. It's more rigorous, more technical, and more forecast driven. In other words, it's built for people who want more than commentary or analysis. They want a sharper, decision useful picture. So the way I'd put it is this: Defense Uncut gives you the discussion. Quwa Plus and Pulse Check give you the analysis, and Quwa Pro gives you the intelligence. And I think that's a really strong structure. It lets us keep the podcast open and accessible while also building higher value offerings for people who want to go deeper. So if you already enjoyed Defense Uncut, nothing is being taken away. If anything, the goal is to make it better over time, bringing in more insight, more guests, and more depth into the show. But if you want regular reporting, more structured analysis, more context on how geopolitical shifts affect Pakistan, and more insight into how India's defense decisions shape Pakistan's options, then I think Quwa Plus is well worth trying. So that's a quick update on my side, and genuinely I'm very excited about where we can take this next. With that said, let's get into this week's episode. So this week, I'm joined by Arslan Khan to talk about some of the lessons Pakistan could draw from the ongoing US-Iran war. We discuss how Iran's loitering munitions, much like we saw in Ukraine, have proven to be important strike assets, while also taking a measured look at the actual effectiveness of its ballistic missiles. We also get into a less discussed side of this war, which is a naval equation, and what those dynamics could mean for the Pakistan Navy. So with that, let's get into it. Hi, Arslan. How's it going?
Yeah, I'm good. How are you?
Good. Long time no see.
Yeah, it's been a while, hasn't it? Good to be back.
Yeah, good to be back here. We have a bunch of elephants in the room, so to speak. Over the past few months, there's been a conflict between Pakistan and Afghanistan on one end. On the other end, we have basically the continual advancement of defense technologies from China. And of course, the big one, the one that is, on the news cycle today is the Iran and US conflict. So from that, a lot has been happening, and I think it's been interesting now in the sense that because the conflict has been of longer duration compared to the one from last year, that we're starting to see a better sense of how Iran's defense and organizational posture is shaking out. And definitely from a policy standpoint, it's a very interesting situation, but that's not the purpose of this episode. But I think it'd be good to get your insights on just how, Iran's investments in things like ballistic missiles, loitering munitions, and its other facets is beginning to pan out today.
I mean, I think we've seen quite well for the last couple of years, first in Ukraine, and now we're seeing in the hands of Iran, and then in this conflict. So we're seeing firsthand the benefit of these low-cost, attritable loitering munitions. And then on the other hand, we're seeing that potentially their investments into stuff like air defense, as opposed to building a functioning air force, or focus on naval assets, particularly submarines and ballistic missiles to an extent, where we've seen with the ballistic missiles, it's quite interesting because we're seeing that the effect of their strikes aren't necessarily anything particularly lethal or degrading in the sense where it's degrading the adversary's capability to strike Iran. We're not necessarily seeing that. However, we do see a fear factor with these ballistic missiles, particularly when you see them get through the Israelis' air defense network, and, you see these cluster warheads screaming down towards the earth. But in reality, we see the effect of them to be quite minimal. These are, 4 or 5 kilo warheads. While they look scary, they're not necessarily doing much on the ground and not necessarily doing much for Iran. So it's quite interesting. We've seen the merits of some systems and not necessarily, and we've also seen how other systems weren't necessarily the greatest investment. And I think we'll touch on that as the episode goes on.
So let's start with the systems that have sort of proven to be a good investment. I think you mentioned basically the attributable loitering munitions. I
Yeah.
think those have I think they made a name for themselves in Ukraine when the Iranians started to export the Shahid series, because I think that was like, there were loitering munitions before that, which the Ukrainians were using quite effectively. But I think it was the Shahid series that really defined the loitering munition, sort of setting like a standard of what the design should be, what the specifications should be. So can you unpack maybe why that has been the case, as opposed to, let's say, the other loitering munition designs?
I think the key with the Shahid is it's such a simple design, but it's also very scalable. I don't know how accurate some of the reporting on the Russian equivalent is, but it's quite interesting to see what Russia managed to do with the Shahid design, where you see now with some of the more recent variants, you've got them attacking in swarms. So you'll have 4, 5, 6 different Gerans, which are their version. And then you'll have a sensor at the front of that pack, sniffing out emissions and planning route flight paths and all that ensure their survivability around AD bubbles and stuff. And this was I think this is something that sort of stems from the older Soviet doctrine, because some of their older cruise missiles actually as well, the naval cruise missiles would sea skim, and then one would pop up every now and then, get a picture of the electromagnetic environment and all that, and then come back down, skimming the surface again, and then pass that information on to the other missiles, which would also further increase its survivability. So I think that's quite the key here, is that the design has a ton of growth potential. I mean, it's a huge aircraft with not much in the way of electronics and systems. A small engine, assume most of its internal volume is dedicated to fuel anyway to get to that impressive range. So you've got the ability to pack a ton of stuff in there if you needed to. You've got Starlink antennas and all this stuff that these countries are able to pack into that airframe without degrading its capability. I think firstly, that's the big benefit, but also the other aspect is it's just so simple to produce, right? You don't need fancy CNC machines, you don't need high-end production lines. You need a couple of guys, some molds, and basic equipment to get these things to work together, to get these things built. And other than that, also stuff like the engine on board, it doesn't need to last thousands and thousands of hours like other engines do. You build it, make it usable enough, whether and the other thing is, right, is these drones, they don't necessarily need to be 100% perfect, right? You're going to have decent amounts that will fail before ever making it to the target. You have tons of them get intercepted before they make it to the target. But the fact is that these are so low cost. I think cost estimates put them at $20,000-$30,000, which is nothing really when you talk about conventional munitions. Something like a JDAM kit is just the same cost as one of these, and you don't need an aircraft to carry these. So I think the key here is just how cheap they are, but also how effective they are. We've seen that they're doing a great job at making it through adversary air defense. While tons of them may get intercepted, you only need a couple of them to hit critical infrastructure, which is, I think, the play that Iran here is going for. Is you need a few of them to hit critical infrastructure, and that will do the job. Now, whether that's necessarily applicable to us, the Indians may not have tons and tons of oil and gas refineries on their side, so it might not create as big of a visual impact like it does when they're striking the Gulf, but it's still a very useful capability to have, that you can create these masses of strikes for such little cost.
So would you be able to sort of unpack, like, I think rather, but there are multiple Shahid variants, and even with the Russians, with the Giran or Giran, they have like multiple variants, including even a turbojet powered one. So are you able to sort of unpack like just the cost approximations of each of these variants, and then also the sort of internal subsystems that some of them would use? Like, for example, you mentioned that the engine does not need to be necessarily very complex. Like, can you like maybe quantify that into like what kind of engine are we talking about? Is it something that a country like Pakistan could potentially produce at scale itself, for example? And same with like things like the guidance suite, the optronics suite, and what have you.
Yeah, so I mean, we can see. So firstly, the types. Let's run it. So firstly, when we're talking the engine, we're talking about a piston engine, right? So these are basically as simple as it gets for aero engines. So there's not a ton to it. You've got a couple of cylinders, some pistons, a carburetor. So these aren't injected. So the engine they use isn't injected. So you don't need fancy electronics or anything. You've got a couple of magnetos and that's it. So it's nothing particularly complex, right? So the production of these things, I genuinely believe that this is something that could be replicated in Pakistan via taking stuff we've already got. So, for example, we mass-produced the CD-70 engine in significant numbers. Now, while I don't believe that the CD-70 engine could be used in this application, I'm sure that those production facilities, however, could be used to build something similar during wartime. So, as I said, they're nothing particularly complex, but also they don't need to last tons of hours. So, when we talk about a standard, piston engine used, I think it was the MQ-9, they use the Rotax 9112. This is an engine I'm actually quite familiar with, but it's designed to last about 2,000 hours before it needs a major overhauls. We don't need that. We need it to last 10 hours, 5 hours, 15, 20 hours, if that, to get to a target and blow itself up. So you don't need fancy metals and all this stuff. It is basically as simple as it needs to last for 10 hours without throwing out a piston or without welding itself together. So it's a very simple bit of engineering on that front. So nothing like the turbines and jets that we think of. Yeah, so with the Shahid, it's a pretty simple and scalable design. You've got tons of growth potential in the airframe. But if we break it down component by component, when we look at something like the engine, for example, it's a low power, reverse engineered engine derived from a German manufacturer. I believe it's the Limbach 550E. That was the original design. With these engines, it doesn't need to last very long. When we look at a conventional piston engine, something like what was used on the original Reaper, I think it was, or back when the drones were just starting to become a big thing, particularly over Afghanistan and whatnot, those drones were using commercially available piston engines, certified ones, stuff like the Rotax 912. And that was a really popular engine, actually, and the TB2 and other in-class drones also used it because it was really cheap to run, really fuel efficient, and really modern. But you don't need that, right? With something like the Shahid, it needs to last 10, 15 hours, 20 hours tops, whereas something like the Rotax 912, that has a time between overhaul of 2,000 hours. So we don't need that. We need something that will last those one mission without welding itself together or without throwing the piston. So these engines, they're made of a couple of main components. You've got your magnetos. These are non-injected engines, so you don't have any fancy electronics. You've got pistons, cylinders, similar stuff to what you see in your car. When it comes to production, I think this is something actually we could scale and produce quite easily within Pakistan. We've got tons and tons of output of the CD-70 engine, and I know people will be like, well, what kind of example is this as a motorbike? But the production line is something that I think could be reused, but also potentially some components. We don't know. Whether the whole engine itself could be used, I don't think that would work. It's not a particularly great design for this application. But the point is the pieces of the puzzle are there. We just need to put them together. In terms of the other components, the Shahid itself, to use a lot of readily available components, so a lot of commercial off-the-shelf components, there was nothing there that was necessarily there that was proprietary. So a lot of the equipment was actually sourced from abroad. You had a ton of American equipment, a ton of Russian, but a lot of it was actually quite American. So you'd find that the satellite units and whatnot, they came from commercial manufacturers. I believe the sat-nav, the GNSS receiver was from a company called U-Blocks, which was an American company. So it's all commercially available stuff. Nothing particularly prohibited or sanctionable. Your video processors were all NVIDIA units. You had standard commercial memory and all that sort of stuff. So there was nothing there that was particularly complex or unrepeatable. Someone like Pakistan, this is something that is completely achievable and doable. I think the direction Pakistan had gone, particularly with the Yeeha series of drones, was quite different to the direction that the Iranians took. The Iranians took a very simple, a simple airframe. We need to be able to pack whatever the bare minimum is needed into and needs to be able to get there. With Pakistan, you saw that, the Yeeha, it was a very fancy airframe, carbon fiber, and had fancy guidance and also infrared and had all this stuff. But it's kind of like putting lipstick on a pig. Is you really just want to get down to the fundamentals to get the cost down, because the function and the end is going to be the same, right? These aren't designed to necessarily be the most survivable things in the world. They're designed to get there, lose a bunch of them, but get there and get there cheap and get the mission done.
So, with that in mind, and I think we've seen some conceptual designs from some private sector vendors in Pakistan sort of emulating the Shahid series. There have been, let's say, reports of the Pakistani armed forces also considering something similar to this from a design conceptual standpoint. But I think the challenge then becomes is that if we're doing it, then it's very likely, if not certain, that India is doing it. And that presents a dual challenge, is that on the one hand, yes, we want to be able to leverage the offensive value of these munitions and be able to deploy them at scale. But at the same time, we will be on the receiving end. Have you seen any work or discussions or anything in the way of trying to stop these things? I think like one of the solutions that might be floated around is, for example, high-powered microwave systems like HPM emitters, right? So the rationale is, okay, if these drones are primarily using commercially off-the-shelf processors and navigation systems and other electronics, and it stands to reason that a pretty good HPM emitter should be able to jam them if they're coming in at, like, let's say with a swarm tactic, right? And yes, granted, you might have some vendors who will apply some sort of, anti-microwave like emission coding on their munitions, but when I looked into it, it seems the HPM vendors are not too worried about that. They think that their emitters can probably, overpower those. Other hand, we see, for example, Ukraine come up with some basically kinetic solutions. So would you be able to discuss that and maybe provide a bit of a discussion on which one of these would be a better approach from a scalability standpoint?
Yeah, of course. So firstly, you mentioned that if we do this, then the Indians will do this. The Indians are already doing this. They've got so many vendors in this space, and so many of them are pitching these low-cost drones, and a lot of them tend to be designs we've seen before as well, whether they're Shahid copies or, I wouldn't say copies, but inspired by Shahids or inspired by other Chinese designs even. There's a bunch of examples like that. But on top of that, the more concerning thing is the huge production ability, right? Some vendors out there in the Indian side have quoted the ability to churn out 10, 15, 20,000 of them a year, which, it doesn't sound like a lot, but remember, that's one vendor. They've got dozens. So if all of them were to come together, they could put out a huge amount of output, and we don't have the same ability to produce at this scale. When you talked about the ability to intercept, now this is something where I am a very big fan of HPM's high power micros. I think it's probably the best solution available to us. Well, whether it's available to us, we don't know, but I think it's probably the best solution available generally, where you have a very low cost per intercept. It's negligible your cost per intercept, but on top of that, you can also take out a bunch of them at once. When we talk about something like a laser, for example, you've got one laser focus on one target for 1 or 2 seconds. That time is quite significant, because within that time, if you've got a swarm of 5 or 6 of them, something's going to hit you by the time by the time you get to it. With the HPMs, however, you don't have that issue. You can cover a decent area and get rid of anything within that area. But on the other hand as well, I actually saw this morning, there was an interesting Polish design where they were converting one of their cargo types, I think it's the M28, into a drone interceptor. And they were doing this with the addition of a door gun, with the addition of some more gun pods, and there was also some APKWS pods. So these are specially designed drone interceptors that they're putting out. They won't be able to buy hundreds of them, but you only need a few of them to guard certain areas. For example, you send out a few of them, have them loiter on station, and then task them to an assignment when and as needed. And I think this is also another pretty good solution. However, once again, it's not necessarily the cheapest. Cost per flight hour of something like that is still not necessarily going to be very cheap. But obviously, your cost per intercept is going to be far lower than something like a Patriot or an AMRAAM. The other option you mentioned was the Ukrainian Sting, which is actually quite an interesting solution. It's a kinetic interceptor. It's another drone. And, the cost of those is, anywhere between $1,000 to $5,000. With proper production runs and facilities, you could probably even drag that cost even lower. Now, with stuff like that, it's a very interesting and very good solution. You're not able to cover an area of them, so you kind of need to have them in certain places, and they need to be there at the right time because they don't have the kind of extended ranges that something like the Polish solution does. You kind of need to have them stationed in areas where you'd expect drone swarms and drones to be in from, and then launch them, or you'd need a bunch of them dispersed all over the place. I mean, either option works, but it's not necessarily the best solution. But then again, no solution is the best solution here. It's kind of a case of combining all of these solutions to come up with a good solution. Having these Sting interceptors placed around high-value assets like air defense or command nodes or infrastructure, that could be a pretty decent solution because they're better suited to local area defense. HPMs, have them, around cities or whatever to give you a reasonably larger area of coverage. And then, something like these airborne patrols is another good solution. And they're able to task large swarms coming from one direction. So that's another also, so it's kind of like building up a layer of air defense, but this time focused purely against this drone threat. Now, we saw during Sindoor, actually, we had pretty good success with the use of the Skyguard system, which was, a radar guided gun, surface gun. So we had pretty decent success with those, but obviously the issue is we just don't have as many of them as needed, and the cost isn't particularly cheap. Each of those bullets, I think, has a cost of, 3,000-4,000 per round. So it's not necessarily the cheapest thing either. But obviously they're fused and they're very, very, very advanced little bullets. But it's not necessarily something that's sustainable. If you're launching a burst, $20,000, $30,000, $40,000 down there within those couple of seconds. So I think it's really a case of building up a solution of multiple solutions. And yeah.
So, I think there's some interesting highlights when it comes to building a counter-UAS strategy for these sorts of loitering munitions. It's like a combination of your traditional anti-air gun solutions like we have with the Skyguard, plus, for example, your directed energy weapon-based solutions like HPMs, plus then some form of kinetic drone-based solution like the Sting or the Mirops. But one other concept that's sort of begun to take off is, I think you had mentioned at one point, for example, or alluded to it, was the idea of using like slower flying aircraft, like your turboprop based trainers as an example, and equipping them with laser guided rockets and gun pods to be able to basically manually comb the skies essentially. And the other side of it is basically using or repurposing something like a target drone, or maybe reworking the target drone into something of like a small fighter drone, basically, that would just carry a couple of laser guided rockets or micro munitions and basically use that to target these loitering munitions. And the reason why I'm sort of bringing this up is that it might not be individually the most scalable, like these platforms, but I think if you're like the Pakistan Air Force and you have an aging fleet of trainers like the T-37s, I'm not aging, like they're beyond like aged trainers, basically. You actually argue the K8s are aging as well. It would be an interesting way of approaching their future requirements where they might say, okay, yes, we have a training requirement, but perhaps we should ensure that we're also accounting for a potential CUAS requirement as well with these same platforms. So what are your thoughts about that?
Actually, I'm sure you remember, I had an interesting solution for this. So when it comes to these training types, the problem with these T-37s and these K8s is they're becoming increasingly hard to sustain and get in the air and keep them in the air. So for a role like this, you're going to put a ton of hours on the airframe, a ton of hours on the engines and all the LLPs and all that sort of stuff. So they're already quite difficult to sustain and keep in the air. So I don't necessarily think these will be the best solutions going forward. However, as you alluded to, slower flying aircraft, cheaper ones that have the ability to carry stuff or can be converted into carrying stuff. So, I mean, obviously, there's an example I told you about the other day, and I'm happy to touch on that now. And so there's a there's a category of experimental aircraft that particularly stateside, because it's quite popular out there, but you can have small experimental aircraft and you can do whatever the hell you want to them. So there was a design called the Subsonics, and it was a personal jet, and it was based off of a cruise missile engine or a target drone engine. And it was a tiny little thing. It had a stall speed of about 60 knots, and it could carry one person. What the OEM did was it turned it into a twin engine UAV. Now, unfortunately, the OEM went bust the other day, but it was quite an interesting design, and I actually thought it could have made quite a good counter drone solution where, something like that is a very slow, and this is now a bit more broad, where something that can fly really slow, because these Shahed types and all these types of drones in class tend to cruise at 120, 130 knots. So you want something that can fly quite slowly. A fighter jet will struggle very hard. I'm sure you've seen some of these videos where these fighter jets are tasked at intercepting drones, and they're putting quite high alpha, so their nose very, very high up to prevent them from stalling at those sorts of speeds. So they're not necessarily designed to take on that role. However, some of these experimentals or just the other slower aircraft are able to fly really, really slow, get a shot on target. The other thing is they're very cheap to make. Something like the Subsonics had a cost of about $55,000 for the kit, excluding the engine. So that's another benefit of these very simple to produce aircraft. It's just sheet metal, aluminium. The other thing is commercial and cheap engines, right? The Subsonics used a PBS engine, whereas you have engines in class from companies like Swingwin, a quarter or a fifth of the cost of the Czech ones. You could use all of these commercial inputs and create a solution that's actually very effective at these sort of drone interceptions. So, for example, with the Subsonics UAV, the twin jet, what they had was it had the ability to get up in the air, cruise on one engine, and loiter for hours and hours on end, and then be tasked and sprint on two engines. Now, that's a pretty decent idea, right? For a solution like this, you just need to be able to mount something on it to take those drones out. But the platform itself is a very good one. It's very low cost. If you lose it, it's not going to sting like it will sting to lose an F-16. It's going to be cheaper than a missile shot. It's reusable, but also you don't have this sort of the sort of lead times as interception times and whatnot, because you can have a bunch of these things flying in the air during a hot conflict, just loitering on one engine for hours on end, and then as soon as you detect from the ground or from your other assets that there's an influx of drones from one sector, you can task them to get there, intercept. They're capable of in-flight restart, so do a sprint and take out whatever needs to be taken out, and then return to base or return to its loiter mode. So you could make a pretty good solution based off of what's available on the market, all these commercially available components.
So what I find interesting about the Sonic's design and the concept is that the the thing that you showed me, it had like a maximum takeoff weight of just a little bit over 1 ton, and I feel like that's like not obviously it's like it's not too far from something like a wingman actionable loyal wingman drone, which would be around 2 to 3 tons, right? I mean, it's still a big leap, but I feel like it's an interesting approach to it where instead of overcomplicating, or maybe instead of pursuing a complicated, stealthy micro jet fighter design, which is, I think, what many loyal wingman designers are doing right now, that you have this alternate approach is where you basically take, okay, like a really simple, low cost platform like the Sonics, and you basically just start enlarging it and seeing, okay, like based on that simple design, can I then incorporate a more, maybe a higher thrust engine? Can I incorporate a better payload? And maybe like things like having an internal payload and stuff is not the priority. It's just like you just want something that focuses more on the expendability, the scalability, the endurance, and maybe some ability to obviously carry like an air-to-air munition or maybe some other sorts of munitions. And I feel like if Pakistan were to even take this kind of approach and maybe emulate the idea, it could actually have like an alternate Shahid equivalent stream of a loyal wingman drone down the line as well.
Yeah, and actually, funnily enough, Pakistan has done this before, and this is the sort of thing that it's quite depressing, where this has been done before. If you look at the Nescom Burak, it's a very familiar design, and the reason why it's such a familiar design is if you look in the US, and you guys can Google this at home, is if you search up the Long Easy. The Long Easy was a manned aircraft designed by Bert Rutan, who's an absolutely amazing engineer. He's built some of the craziest stuff there is. He's got a company now, Scaled Composites, and he's making some absolutely insane stuff. And the Long Easy, just as a side note, is probably one of my favorite aircraft, and I'd love to fly one. But it was such a interesting design. It was a pusher canard prop. And the one amazing thing you'll see is if you go around the world and you look up the DRDO Rustam, their UAV, if you look up the CH-3, the Chinese one, if you look up the Burak, and I'm sure there's other countries as well, they all stem from the Long Easy. Everyone took the Long Easy, dumped their mission systems inside it, and turned it into a drone. That's what they did. And this is nothing new. This is nothing groundbreaking being proposed here. That's exactly what you could do with to create this sort of Shahed drone interceptor, but also the attritable loyal wingman, which I'll touch on in a second. And in fact, the ability to modify these things is so amazing where, you've got home builders, guys like me, guys like you, who are able to go, they say, oh, that engine looks great. That would be good to have in there. And they can do this. There's also a jet-powered Long Easy that wasn't built by Rattan or a huge company. That was built by a couple of guys in their garage. So the point is there's so this is nothing particularly difficult or complex for a country with money to throw, more money than an individual builder, for example. but the point is, there's nothing groundbreaking. This is nothing that's not been done before, and it's nothing that's not been done by Pakistan before, because we've done this with the Long Easy and the Shahpur and the Burak series. Now, in terms of the attritable lower wingman point you make, it's a very interesting one, because the subsonics had a useful load of about 550 pounds. So that's fuel and anything else that needs to be carried. However, on there, as you mentioned, it's something that could be scaled, right? With access and proper equipment and teams and money, anything, it can be scaled because it's a very simple design. It's all just a bunch of aluminium sheets, mechanical flight controls. There's nothing inherently complex there. So being able to scale that up into something designed to get shot out of the sky is no problem. You can you don't need it to be immensely capable. You need it to be able to take instructions from a rear aircraft and do whatever it's told. If you can carry a single air-to-air missile on it, that's a great feat, because you can send it forward, have it do whatever it needs to. And if it gets shot out of the sky, it's no massive loss. You lose, 100, 200,000, maybe 300,000. But when you consider that, for example, something like an AMRAAM costs $500,000 to $1 million, it's not necessarily the worst value proposition here, in the context of air-to-air combat.
So I'll give you a more interesting story, because you were mentioning about these like weird, or let's call them weird, let's call them zany experimental projects. So there'd been, and it's still around, but it's not as maybe prominent as it used to be, but there's a private company called Integrated Dynamics in Pakistan, and maybe around 10 years ago, they were working on this optionally piloted vehicle platform. And I remember speaking to like a retired PAF pilot, and he was like, I'll never in my life ever fly a non-certified platform like that. But it was pretty funny, because I think when you start digging into these, like, the point is the point of an optionally piloted vehicle is when I started researching them and stuff, like they're not there to be marketed as OPVs. They're rather experimental platforms for further design, research, and testing. So even, for example, scaled composites in the US, I mean, granted, now they have Northrop behind them, so they're definitely not a one-to-one comparison. But you notice that a lot of their conceptual projects, like let's say Model 437, like even though it's an OPV, technically speaking, it's really designed for them. They're basically using it to help them research and develop future, loyal wingmen, basically, and try to figure out ways of reducing the cost, make them more attritable. Right? I mean, it literally says here, like the Model 437 is essentially a design concept to help them with, exploring multi-mission, low-cost, attritable aircraft. So even though it's manned, I doubt the intent for them is to put a human being in an attritable aircraft. So the point being is that, like, this stuff is, not only was Pakistan doing it before, but it's evidently, if you look at the fact, consider how few resources Pakistani companies have, how many restrictions they deal with, the fact that ID could get a optionally piloted vehicle off the ground tells you that the delta to doing this stuff isn't that significant either. Like, if you were to just maybe pivot some of the investment money away from, and we're being a bit cheeky here, but away from buildings and commercial plots and that kind of stuff, you could probably get a couple of these sorts of projects off the ground. And if you consolidate them, you could probably get a pretty good R&D stream off the ground as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And just another fun side note is the experimental community is quite small. So back when in the 80s and 90s, when the Pakistanis, they went to the US and tried to buy these Long Easies, there was a rumor going around, sorry, not a rumor, but these Americans, they were telling each other, like, guys, if a Pakistani comes to you to try and buy these things, don't sell them to him. They're going to go back and they're going to turn them into drones. And that's exactly what they did. And actually, you mentioned Integrated Dynamics, and it's actually very interesting because Integrated Dynamics was also producing Long Easy kits, which I assume were ending up as Buraks and drones for the Air Force and other entities.
So let's switch to the other end of the equation because you had mentioned that the ballistic missiles, although Iran's ballistic missiles had a big show factor and from a perceptual standpoint seemed to have a big impact. The reality is that on the ground, these are not having the effect that you know you might assume they're having. Could you unpack that a bit more?
Yeah, absolutely. So look, these ballistic missiles, they've got a great fear factor, but the other issue, let me break it down step by step rather. So firstly, the problem for Iran is that the Israelis have an amazing early warning network because the entire Gulf is their early warning network to an extent, right? On our front, this might not necessarily be as much of an issue. However, obviously India being on our border, you never know, right? You know, they've got a ton of radars pointed towards us. So it is something they will be able to detect. However, their detection to interception time is far less than what the Israelis have, for example. The Israelis detect a launch. They've got 15 minutes at times to prepare and also prepare interception. So for them, they've got this, they're very, very fortunate in this sense, whereas the Indians and also us aren't necessarily fortunate in this sense where, you know, from detection to interception, maybe we've only got a couple of minutes. This, however, also does bring and this is something Asim would be better placed to talk about, however, is it does also give you the option for more interesting intercepts, like boost phase intercepts, which are typically more reliable than something like a mid-course intercept. But that's something Asim can touch on a little bit better than me. However, when we look at the ballistic missiles in use in in Israel more, we see that the effect on the capabilities of the Israelis is basically nothing. The US has lost launches, has lost expensive radars and whatnot. Again, the degradation of capability just isn't there, like, for example, a strike on Iran would have, because the US and the Israelis expect these losses and they've built their systems around the fact that these losses will happen, and they've built them in such a way that they're able to absorb these losses. So we can see that the Iranians were launching, you know, waves and waves and waves of ballistic missiles, hundreds at a time, but realistically, only a handful were getting through. Now, some people can say the Iranians were using their old stocks and less capable missiles to deplete the Israelis' air defense stocks. However, how long can we believe that argument? Because we're now, you know, a few weeks into the war and we're not seeing any significant ability of the Iranians to be able to strike the Israelis to any meaningful effect. We've not seen any significant strikes on air bases in Israel that have degraded their capabilities. While we've seen the US take some hits on aircraft, once again, the capabilities they've not really lost their ability to carry out the missions as needed. We've seen now that the Iranians have also switched to cluster munitions, which are far more effective at getting through. However, once again, there's no real effect of them. They have a very good psychological effect / fear factor. Now, on the ground, if you're an Israeli, seeing this, your impenetrable defenses fail and seeing these missiles scream towards the ground at insane speeds, but also seeing these cluster munitions falling to the ground, it's terrifying, right? And also because, you know, the average person isn't going to be able to tell the difference between a cluster munition and a cluster warhead and a normal ballistic missile. To them, it's all the same, right? They're going to think, oh, wow, there's something screaming down to the ground that's going to cause lots and lots of deaths. But the reality is it's a 5-6 kilo warhead and it's not really doing much damage. You know, you might put a hole in a road for, you know, but what's that going to do? What's that going to do for Iran? What's that going to do against the Israelis? So you can see that the effect of it is not necessarily anything particularly beneficial for the Iranians. And I think at this point, the Iranians would have been far better off focusing a lot of their energy on their navy and their ability to degrade the shipping lines and the naval aspect of the attack. While the US Navy hasn't been as directly involved, the ability to choke the global economy would have been one that would have probably had a far greater effect than a few ballistic missiles getting through Israeli air defenses and whatnot.
I think this is where, for Pakistan, is probably the most illustrative point because, you know, granted, we can accept that you need to invest in low cost, high scale loitering munitions.
Yeah,
Understood.
absolutely.
Correspondingly, you need to invest in very strong multi-layered or multi-solution based or integrated solutions based CUAS systems, and you should be very flexible in how you innovate on those. So don't be too dogmatic. You do some sonic style experimentation. You know, try to build the Shahid series equivalent of of a loyal wingman. Like, do that kind of stuff because it's going to be valuable later on. Perfect. So yes, we know that Pakistan is developing its own stack of conventional ballistic missiles, and we have an Quwa Plus article that's going to come out about it, where we're basically sort of assessing that, okay, Pakistan might be around 10 to 15 years behind Iran in the development track. Because Iran, if you look at the development track of what Iran did and what Pakistan's been doing, is very like 1-to-1. So Iran did start off with like their own like MLRS type Fatah solution, right? Very similar, like based off a Chinese system. And then they started to basically reverse engineer and localize it. And then they went on to a single stage ballistic missile solution, again, similar to the Fatah 2. And then they basically started developing from there, and they started building two-stage systems and so on and so forth. And you can kind of get a sense that maybe Pakistan is intending to do the same by trying to reuse one platform and scale it out. But that, I think, in an interesting way, that although the PAF, and there's a big controversy, and I know in the forum space about whether the PAF was able to sort of prove it out and show that it was able to initiate a successful strike on India's air defense systems. I think the intent, both for the Army and the Pakistan Air Force, is that you're going to use these ballistic missiles for very specific functions. And you can look back to the way Ukraine used them against Russia to maybe, deprecate at a tactical level, like, destroy a bridge here, destroy a radar there, to sort of move your wider operations along. They're not like the one all be all, like the way the Iranians have sort of framed their ballistic missiles, like, hey, our ballistic missiles will rain fear on you. No, they're really there to sort of be this quick, relatively low cost method of moving your wider operations along, maybe deprecating some of your enemy's capabilities, maybe reducing their air defense systems and what have you, or helping your army destroy bridges and power stations and what have you. I think where it gets really interesting, as you mentioned, is the submarines, right? Because the Pakistan Navy is now sitting there, and this war could completely change how the Pakistan Navy approaches its procurement strategy moving forward. Like, in a sense, we see them sort of be relatively quiet about even the Jinnah-class frigate, right? Like, that was the flagship program. And they're like, we signed up contract for one or two of these, but we have like 3 different underwater unmanned vehicle projects going on.
So I think the biggest takeaway, while the land stuff and the air force stuff in Iran was pretty expected, I think the naval aspect of this war is the most interesting aspect, and particularly also the most applicable aspect to the Pakistan theater. As you mentioned, there's a ton of programs going on and whatnot, but the key takeaway here, and I really want to stress this, is it's all well and good having all these submarines and all these aircraft, but unless they can get in the air or unless they can get out of their pens and docks, they're useless. And I think what we saw with Iran was that most, if not all, of their naval assets and also their submarines were taken out in the docks. They were not able to get through. And I believe the Navy is building a base in Ormara for the new submarines. But I think the biggest takeaway here would actually be some sort of underwater submarine pen. Underwater, the pens in the mountains, like the Soviets would do, particularly Ormara, because it's quite mountainous terrain. So, you've got that aspect to actually be able to ensure that you're able to get your assets out there and actually do what they need to, because a submarine is only good if it's underwater and doing what it needs to.
Exactly. And I think with the Pakistan Navy, the other aspect is that projects like the SWATs, the Shallow Water Attack Submarine projects like the Next Generation Original Escape Program, I think these are going to be priority number one. And I wouldn't be surprised if even the Pakistan Army and Air Force sort of really not direct, but let's say really encourage the Navy to think along these lines, because to be fair, like, the surface warships did play a valuable role in the current context, in the situation where you have this war going on between the US and Iran, and you need to give your merchant navy a sense of security. So you have like these really decked out warships that go out, and in these hybrid situations, like, your ships aren't under threat, but you have these warships that are fully equipped going out in these hostile situations. It gives the merchant navy a sense of like, hey, they're supporting me, right? Fair enough. And you need those surface warships for those kind of situations. But in wartime, when you're the target, it's the submarines that are going to make the biggest difference. Because I think you imagine if you have like both secure submarine pens within the mountains, but also a culture, or let's say operational process, where you have deployed more than 50% of them at sea at any given time. So you ensure that your entire submarine fleet is not in maintenance mode, basically, right? I think those two aspects are going to give you the most security, because it's ironic, Pakistan has a geographic disadvantage against India on the ground, but I would argue that it might have maybe more flexibility in the ocean against India, because if you can basically line up your submarine fleet across the western side of the Arabian Sea, you can create problems for the merchant navies that have to trade with India, because you can see that merchant navies are fickle. So if they feel that Pakistan is going to destroy tankers and stuff, they might not go to India, right? That can have a severe impact. So I think having that well-provisioned, maybe disproportionately sized submarine fleet is the solution, and they can take different approaches to it. Like, it doesn't have to be like your 700-ton to 2,000-ton design, which might be a bit costly. You can maybe build out a large fleet of 100, 150-ton XL UUVs, for example, right? I think it seems like there's a lot of attention going into that. And again, scalability matters. So I think that could be an interesting approach for the Pakistan Navy.
Yeah, absolutely. But also the other aspect, the other thing I would want to put some attention to is the large surface fleet. Pakistan Navy had a goal of 20 large surface combatants, and I would really put some consideration towards culling this number. You don't necessarily. What we're seeing here is clearly that we don't necessarily need 20, 8 or 10 Jinnah-class frigates. We could potentially be better off with some smaller air defense frigates, which would be better off to this role. Something like the OPV series that we've got, or further developing the Hangor-class, which then would allow more funds to be directed towards the submarine fleet. Because the larger the ship it is, the bigger the target it is, and because they're so costly, it's a serious loss losing one of them, and it's very difficult to assure their survival in these sorts of conflicts, as we've seen in Iran, but also particularly in our theatre where we see the Indian Navy is a very, very credible threat. You could say that the Pakistan Air Force and the Indian Air Force are more closely matched. However, it's a very disproportionate advantage to the Indian Navy, particularly in the surface fleet area. Subsurface, I'd also say that they're more matched. However, surface fleet-wise, there's no competition. The question there is how survivable are these surface ships in our conflicts?
And this has been a debate, I would argue, within the Pakistan Navy for decades. Like, I think they've gone back and forth on this. And there was a time, and I remember, like, maybe around the 90s and early 2000s, there was this sense that belief that the Pakistan Navy should really double down on its subsurface fleet and, to a lesser extent, build out its aviation capabilities. Because the sense was that, you have, for example, not faster, but let's say jet powered maritime patrol aircraft that can move relatively quickly for your surveillance and first response mechanisms for anti-submarine warfare. And on the other hand, you have your submarines to help out with deterrence and basically anti-ship and anti-submarine warfare as well. And also, they also invested in the underwater acoustic network as well. So a lot of these, I think what happened maybe was that there was a sense that there wouldn't be a hot conflict with India. A certain that was like a perception they had maybe, and then that's when we saw the bigger investment in the surface warships. So that's like around the 2015, 2016 era. I remember that's when that conversation started taking off more. But I could see moving forward the Navy maybe stepping back on that, and again, as you said, focusing more on the subsurface side, and maybe to an extent things like coastal defense capabilities. So you have like your coastal base anti-ship ballistic missiles, anti-ship cruise missiles, and obviously air defense systems from the coast. But I think definitely, to your point, it would also be really interesting to see if they maybe take an Israeli approach where they try to rework the Jinnah-class frigate, which is not too different from the Babur-class corvette. I mean, the same underlying design, but rework it as into being more of an air defense frigate, right? So maybe look for those deeper VLS cells from Turkey, look for maybe investments in the Cyper air defense system, and just have two of those ships, right? Like, don't worry about having too many of them. Just have one active for area-wide air defense near the coast, and then the other one is like a reserve, maybe.
Well, even on the other hand, instead of even going that far, you could look at something like the Diamond frigates, the Diamond corvettes we have. That you've got, I believe it was 12 cells on the 26 on the OPV 2600, which is the same as the Babur class. So, and I'm sure those are something that are even more scalable with how flexible and modular they are from design. So the point is I don't necessarily see the Navy, and the other thing is while we know that the Navy has committed a certain level of resources to the Jinnah class frigate, I don't think it's necessarily out of murky waters in the sense where the program is 100% going to go on, because we've seen this before where the Navy has gone purchased and sunk a lot of money into programs like the Khalid class, which was the transfer of technology for the French submarines, or the Zulfikar class, which had a transfer of technology from China. So they had all these plans, but all of these plans faltered. I believe the original intention was to build 16 Khalid class submarines. So the goal was always there to have a 20 strong submarine fleet. But with different CNSs, the priorities changed. So you saw some attention be given to the surface fleet. Then you saw greater attention being given to the submarine fleet. And now, once again, we're seeing a bit more of a balanced approach where we've got, a decent amount of attention being given to the subsurface fleet, but also the surface fleet. So, I don't necessarily think the program is out of dangerous waters, and it could very well get canned. However, I do think that the approach being taken currently is probably not the most ideal, and that the Navy should focus more on smaller, cheaper ships that are capable of defending themselves. Having these diamond frigates pack them with more missiles, because as I said, they've got space, right? They're designed to be flexible, designed to carry a variety of different payloads. And we know that Pakistan Navy has a great relationship with Daman, and in fact, I believe Daman is one of the Daman will probably at some point set up some sort of local production capabilities in Pakistan, especially now that they're a partner of the maritime, was it technology park, something like that.
Yeah,
So
Pakistan Navy nest up, basically.
yeah, so there's some interest there, and I think that Daman will probably further pursue some of these Pakistan Navy contracts because the original requirement for the OPVs, I think there was about 6 ships, and we've got what 4 now. So I think that's probably a better option to go for. However, at the end of the day, the amount of resources and uh, public interest in the program, in the Jinnah-class program, will probably make it a decent priority for the Pakistan Navy. But I think it's a case of they're putting their fingers in far too many pies, because you also see that they're having to cut back on certain areas where, you've got the Daman frigates, for example, they're fitted for, but they're not fitted with the missile systems. Or I believe some of the other OPVs are missing radars still, or, the Barbars are missing CUAs, etc. It's very, they've bought bits and bobs, and some parts are still missing. So it's clearly, obviously, financing is always going to be the number one issue. And I think it's probably a case of they need to start thinking which pie to take which finger out of and where it should be refocused.
So returning to the Iran war just for a second, I think one of the things, Asim had brought up a while back was that, look, Iran sort of, for whatever reason, both internal domestic purposes, but also due to international constraints, had focused primarily on its ballistic missile stocks and its asymmetrical warfare capabilities to the detriment of its conventional warfare capabilities. So the big loser in this being both the Iranian Navy, which got sunk literally at port essentially, and also the Iranian Air Force, which has not been able to get a modern fighter no matter what anyone offers it. For example, I don't think the Russians had a problem with transferring them the Su-35. I don't think even the Chinese have problems with selling them fighter aircraft. The problem has been that I think it's internal, that the IRGC just distrusts they just distrust the wider Iranian military for whatever reason. And would you argue that potentially that had the Iranians invested in, let's say, at least their Air Force, right, the way Pakistan invests in the Pakistan Air Force, that the nature of this conflict could have maybe changed a little bit, also accounting for the fact that they still have the ballistic missiles and what have you?
I think in the case of the Iranians, I think they were, for lack of a better term, cooked in any way. With the conventional air force, the fact is that they were facing such overwhelming superiority that no matter what they did, they wouldn't have had the ability to create any meaningful impact on the adversary's operations in a defensive form. However, and I think this is a debate that's also been going on the forum for a little bit now as well, is defense sufficient now at this point? Because while we saw with the Indians, they launched their strikes, and if they were able to amplify their strikes, that could effectively decapitate the Pakistan Air Force and Navy and Army by degrading some of their capabilities to start with. So is waiting for an attack the best strategy here, or is going for like a defensive offensive posture where you get a sense and your intelligence is telling you that, look, an attack is imminent and whatnot, and you go ahead and launch those decapitation strikes against the adversary, going to be a better means of defense? And I think in that sort of scenario, having an air force for Iran would have been extremely valuable, because so not only having an air force would have been valuable, but their ballistic missiles would probably have also been far more valuable in that sort of posture. However, Iran waited for strikes to begin on their territory, decapitating their chain of command, their launchers. They had a bunch of underground launch sites and underground storage sites. They've only got one way in, one way out, for example. So if those roads are blown up, or if those entrances are blown up, well, you might be able to have all the ballistic missiles in the world, but if you can't launch them, they're no good. So that I believe that it's not necessarily here a case of Air Force and ballistic missiles, but rather a case of, I think, countries, particularly smaller countries, now need to start taking the offensive footing and being able to degrade their adversary's ability before theirs is degraded.
I agree. And I think that has been, at least with the chairman, the Joint Chiefs Staff Committee, he sort of alluded to that, where he basically said that, moving forward, Pakistan would have to basically push the escalation ladder, irrespective of what India is doing. And there had been a subtle implication, at least in my view, that he was calling for a bit of a doctrinal change where, this is where you basically do have to take the preemptive approach, right? So impeding attack, or maybe, for example, on May 7th, one could have argued that during the air war or the air combat between the Indian Air Force and Pakistan Air Force, that the Pakistan Army should have crossed the border at that point to force the conflict in, let's say, Kashmir, as opposed to having India focus on Pakistan's air bases, for example. And again, that would have been escalatory. But the reality is that, I think now in these sorts of conflicts, most countries are going to be looking to decapitate their enemy's main offensive capabilities within the first 48 to 72 hours, if not earlier. So you may have to basically take that, as you said, offensive defensive posture. So in relation to that, I want to also get your thoughts on the argument that Pakistan should be investing in things like underground facilities and hardened bunkers and that kind of stuff. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, just before we come to that question, you mentioned the decapitation strikes and the degrading the adversary's abilities in the first couple of days of the war, and I think that's something that's been very that's common all across the world in every conflict. However, where I think this would be quite interesting for Pakistan is Pakistan's doctrine has always been be able to sustain a war for a short, high intensity war where other parties would step in. Now, when we think back to the one-way attack drone conversation and also the conversation about cruise missiles and ballistic missiles, I think here most countries, Pakistan, India included, have the knowledge and have the preparation to be able to they know that the adversary is going to try this high intensity conflict first couple of days and expend most of their munitions and stockpiles. I think the other key aspect here is to be able to sustain these attacks, because we can see that both the Israelis, their air defensive stockpiles are tapering down, but also the Iranians have tapered their launches. We've got launches down 90, 91, 92% since the first couple of days. And I think the key here is also being able to sustain these waves of attacks beyond the first couple of days, to be able to continue that intensity and pressure on the other side, because at that point the equation starts tipping in our favor. Most countries will have stockpiles of air defense and munitions to be able to last the first couple of days of a high intensity war. However, you don't necessarily see that in the offensive side. You don't necessarily see enough munitions to be able to offensively keep the pressure up on the other against the ad. So these sort of low cost attritable drones here, the benefit here is being able to scale them up at such an insane pace where you can continue that pressure beyond the first couple of days and really then get to take advantage of the lack of munitions on the other side, particularly air defense ones, because of the cost imbalance there. You can really start to take advantage of those munitions, the lack of those munitions, and the degrading stockpiles on the other side beyond the first couple of days.
And what I think one interesting thing for Pakistan in this context might be that, look, we understand that the Pakistani industry right now, and maybe for the foreseeable future, will not be able to scale output across all these areas, especially things like air defense missiles and what have you. But this is where I think the relationship with China needs to be leveraged correctly, because we know that at one level, the Chinese do have surplus production capacity. They are well oriented for very cost effective exporting. It is also plausible that some of the inputs that Iran is using for its drones are coming through from China as well. So I think one option could be that maybe with Pakistan is that in the near term, you sort of have to build a giant stockpile of the inputs that you need for drones, air defense missiles, and what have you, and then just build relatively simple distributed assembly factories, like the way Ukraine does it. Like, what are your thoughts on that approach?
Yeah, sorry, and sorry. So talking about the taking advantage of other production facilities from the other countries, I think while China is a good example, I think China's focus is primarily the US, and they're not necessarily interested in the additional orders they'll gain from somebody like us. It will make a negligible difference to their costs and their production facilities and runs. I think the key here is to leverage the other middle powers like Turkey, like the Saudis, to be able to create this sort of, I said this before as well, as this sort of Eastern MBDA, right, where we've all got our own industries, but we should all join hands to create to design these systems that we all have a requirement for. While our requirements may differ to some extent, it's kind of like a case of where you're going to have to compromise, because the benefit is far greater than the requirement difference. You've got the ability to scale in huge production numbers. You've got the ability to drive costs down in huge numbers, because you've got 3, 4, 5 countries in this sort of missile alliance. You can really drive those costs down, but also you can pull on each other's stockpiles. And I think this is a very key point in a hot conflict like this, is the ability to pull on each other's stockpiles. We've got, let's say the Turks have stocks of air defense munitions that we really desperately need. We can use those as needed, like the US has been doing, where they've pulled on Japanese stockpiles of Patriot interceptors, Standard missile interceptors, or South Koreans. But also the other benefit here is you've got multiple production lines. Say in a hot conflict, our production line gets knocked out. That would mean our production line for a Fatah gets knocked out. That would mean that's it. We're not able to produce anymore, because we don't have huge production lines. We don't have multiple of them. We've got the one or maybe two, whatever, very small ones. So if we lose that, then we lose our ability to replace those stocks and to produce those in a conflict. However, the approach I propose here is sort of call it an Eastern MBDA, and I've talked about this before, is if we had a sort of missile alliance with the Turks, the Saudis, and other middle powers like us who really need higher end capable munitions, but the reality is the scale is not there, meaning the costs per unit are insanely high. This is something that would be extremely beneficial to us, not only from a cost perspective. However, if we all had a requirement for, say, let's say a short range ballistic missile, we've got all of these countries, for example, the Saudis, the Turks, and the Pakistanis have their individual strengths. If we combine those to create a system that works for all of us, it might not be perfect. It might not be exactly what our leadership wants. It might not, there will need to be a compromise. However, if we're able to have something like that in place, we would have 3 different stockpiles, 3 different production lines, and 3 different sources of technology to be able to pull on during a hot conflict. And we've seen this with the US in this case, where they saw that their interceptor stockpiles were faltering, so they were able to pull on the Japanese production lines for the standard missiles, or to be able to pull on South Korean stockpiles. And I think this is one area where we really critically lack is, our systems. We've only got 1, maybe 2 production lines for, let's say, something like a Fatah missile. We might only have 1 production line, and a very small one at that as well. So our output is going to be very minimal. We're not going to be able to stockpile components as easily, but also we only have our stockpile. But let's say in a hot conflict where we expend our stockpiles, where we lose the production line, where we lose the people, where we lose our stockpiles, we know that the Saudis or the Turks, they also have that, and we're able to pull on each other's stockpiles to be able to replenish these lost missiles. But also we know that the production lines aren't knocked out, so anything that is replenished anything that is used can be replenished via our partner production lines. So while you do mention, while the China point is valid, I think it really only works if we're able to buy off the shelf what the Chinese are selling as a sort of addition to their own output. If we were to, however, go to China and be like, look, we need this, we need it to be like this, we want it to be different, blah, blah, I don't think they'd be interested in having our input necessarily, because their focus is the US, but also they have such insane levels of internal economies of scale to pull on. They've got huge orders and tons of money to spend. I don't necessarily think it's something that they'd be very interested in. However, the Turks or the Saudis would be.
I think that goes into the conversation from a policy standpoint. If you're Pakistan, is you should start taking things like consortium building and stuff more seriously. And I think we don't have enough mechanisms to properly facilitate that. Within Pakistan, we also have a bit of a culture of red tape and silos and what have you. Like, just a classic example is like, I would argue personally that an entity like NASTAP should be focusing more on cybersecurity, closest in proximity to the civilian sector. Like, literally, their facilities are in the middle of cities and what have you. They are making a push to hire broadly from the wider populace. They don't have necessarily the same guardrails and security checks as, let's say, NESCOM would. And NESCOM is already adept at things like munitions development. It's already adept at things like drone development. And then on the electronic warfare and sensor side, you do have the NRTC, right? Which is, again, like, you have these like redundant efforts whereas at the same time you have this huge glaring gap on cybersecurity front, for example, or AI applications front, or any other, or just like in IT and software in general, which it would have been a golden opportunity to have maybe NASTAP positioned for that, right? And to have like a bit of a dual use industry approach. And on the consortium side is that, again, like, it's not a new story that the Turks have, been approaching Pakistan with invitations to collaborate on different programs, not least the Khan fighter, right? Which we dropped on our end very, very infamously, I would argue. So again, like, the approach is all valid. I think it's just an issue is that with Pakistan's decision makers, I think one part of it is that expediency is priority. So basically, like, they, as you saw with the air defense procurements and whatnot, they just have, for whatever reason, an institutional preference for the Chinese. And it could just be as simple as the fact is that Chinese have a credit line available to Pakistan right now to be able to use, right? Whereas with the Turks, you have to have basically, cash to be able to engage with them, because they cannot on their own bankroll our projects for us, right? And on the other hand, with the Saudis, I think, Asim and I will discuss this as well, is that we just haven't managed the Saudi relationship as effectively as we should have, because we just have, as a from our policy making standpoint, a very weird situation where we take ambiguous stances and we don't really clearly, for whatever reason, some of it's valid, but some of it I argue is also due to internal mismanagement, where we don't take a stand on whose interests we're willing to stand for, right? So I think with the Saudi Mutual Defense Agreement is a very classic example where is a defense agreement, and then we're going around saying is that because, because of this agreement and because of us, Iran is not hitting Saudi Arabia as much as it could. It's like such a deflating posture to take, where you sign a defense agreement, not a diplomacy agreement. So I think
Yeah.
these issues prevent the
I think
dream
the
of the Central Consortium in the short term.
Yeah. And also the problem is we have this culture where we seem to know better, where one person who might, let's say somebody with a bit more experience, he might go around and say, he knows better. It needs to be done this way, that way. Everyone else has no clue what they're talking about. So you've also got that sort of problem. And Asim will love to talk about this if he gets an opportunity, is that you tend to it's not necessarily the environment for stuff like this to thrive, because you've got too much power resting on people who it shouldn't be, people who don't have the industry experience, who don't have the project management experience. All they have is a couple of years of service, which I say all they have, but they've got some years of service and some hands-on experience, which is great. They're not they've not had to design a cruise missile or something or years.
Yeah, I think a good example, if you look at the Turkish industry, like the Turkish Armed Forces Pensions Foundation, or their pensions fund, is the main or one of the main investors in Turkish aerospace, Aselsan, Havelsan, and what have you. But when you look at the day-to-day operations of those entities, they're all run by essentially experts in those fields, right? Like engineers, aerospace engineers, scientists, electronics engineers, and what have you. People have done PhDs in the US, the UK, and obviously within Turkey as well, because they're bringing back that knowledge pool and that knowledge industry back home, and they're able to they've been able to basically build a domestic R&D pool as well. So I mean, that's really the culture, right? And that's the culture that allows R&D and these sorts of things to thrive. And then again, on the business development front, the one to come up with a consortium idea and really execute on it would be a person who has experience in building MNCs properly, with actual investment, with actual profit-driven KPIs, someone who knows how to, or a team that knows how to build cross multinational partnerships, and also navigate the the international regulations for that, and be able to convince investors in a Turkey, like for example, convince the Turkish investors, hey, like we should have production facilities in Pakistan because we have this huge labor pool. We can reduce the cost, but it requires an upfront, and we can get an ROI on this within 5-10 years, right? So you need to pay upfront, but we'll guarantee the ROI in 10 years because of the A, B, C, D. And we just don't, those sorts of people, they exist. There are Pakistanis who do that. They work in places like Deloitte, KPMG, Nestle, Boeing, Lockheed. And the point being is that at the end of the day, it's like those people are not in the positions that you need them to be within Pakistan to be able to push these sorts of things, and then the results show, basically.
Yeah, I think basically, above all else, it always comes down to this: is we need to create the environment for these things to thrive, and that's when we'll actually see some tangible benefits, not only in our production abilities, but we'll see the effects of this all throughout the economy, down to our defense abilities.
So I'll leave it there, Arslan. Thank you for joining me for this episode, and to our listeners, once more, feel free to send us your questions, commentary, insights through our YouTube channel, and also through the contact@quwa.org email address. We'll be sure to take a listen, and we'll try to also resume our Q&A sessions at the end of the episodes. So once again, we'll be returning to a weekly cadence for Defense Uncut. So once again, thank you, take care, and bye.